Hello and welcome to the Crisis Point Podcast. I'm Eric Sammons, your host and the editor-in-chief of Crisis Magazine. Just want to remind people to like and subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to it or watch it. I'd really appreciate that. It helps other people find out about it. Well, not too long ago, we celebrated, if that's the right word, the 40th anniversary of the phenomenon of Medjugorje. Back in 1981, in a small town in then Yugoslavia, the Blessed Virgin Mary was claimed to be appearing to seven young people. And what's remarkable is that some of those visionaries claim that she still appears to them even to this day, so 40 years later. And so I thought this would be a good topic. I know most people know about Medjugorje, know the basics of it. But I wanted to kind of go through the basics of it today and also talk about the problems associated with it, whether or not it's really a true apparition or not, how it compares to other Marian apparitions. And so what I decided to do is bring on Donal Anthony Foley. He is the author of Medjugorje Complete, the definitive account of the vision and visionaries from Angelical Press. He lives in England, has degrees in humanities and theology, and previously worked as a part-time teacher. After a walking pilgrimage to Fatima in the early 1980s, he became interested in the topic of Marian apparitions, particularly how to distinguish between true and false ones. This led to the publication of his Marian apparitions book and the creation of the theotokos.org.uk site. And like I already said, he is the author most recently of Medjugorje Complete, which I have right here. And so from Angelical Press. So welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Eric. It's good to be with you.
Yeah, so obviously from one thing I just want to say before we even get into this is that you have definitely an interest in Marian apparitions and have for some time now. And so how did you first you said a walking pilgrimage to Fatima, it says here. So tell me a little bit about that, about your encounter with Fatima and how that got you interested in Marian apparitions just in general.
Yeah, well, what happened was I was out of the church and I sort of came back in the 1980s. And I was lucky to meet a family who were arranging a pilgrimage to Fatima. And it was going to be a walking pilgrimage. And in the end, they did it for 3 years. So I took part in it. I actually went down with the husband to down through Spain and Portugal. And we were working out a route. But in the end, about 20 odd people went with them. And some of them walked 600 miles. So it was a big, it was a tough thing. But the way it worked out, I only did the last week. And I was supposed to meet up with my friend with the vans. But obviously, days before mobile phones and so on, they weren't there where they were supposed to be. And so in the end, we had to walk the last week, as it were. But the problem was, of course, we had these big rucksacks and things, so it was really tough. And that the person I was doing it with was actually he'd been in the Royal Marines, so he was like the commando, whatever the American equivalent is. So I was continually trying to keep up with him. And but anyway, despite all that, by the time I got to Fatima, I just felt like I was on a sort of cloud spiritually. And then gradually the message, I got a grasp of the message. Of course, the whole thing with Fatima is prayer and penance. That's the original thing. And we actually stayed, this is 30 odd years ago now, we stayed at a place which was a diocesan sort of hostel for a diocese further up in Portugal, and called the Casa Abrigo. And there you slept in dormitories and you just had bread and water. That was the only repast. So anyway, that was my introduction to it. And then I realized how important apparitions were. And then I just read up about it. And I went to Medjugorje in 1988, but wasn't really impressed, even though I didn't really understand the ins and outs of it. So, and then I just got more and more into the thing and wrote the book about the Marian apparitions book about how they fit in with history.
Right.
And it's just gradually grown from there. Then I did the first version of the Medjugorje book, and going into it as a sort of skeptic and saying, well, I really want to know, is it true or not? So I was approaching from that aspect.
So when you went when you went to Fatima, before you left, did you already believe that the Blessed Mother had appeared in Fatima before your pilgrimage, or was that more that happened while you're in your pilgrimage? You recognize that this is a legitimate apparition.
Yeah, it's difficult to say. I think at that point I'd read a few things and I'd been sort of convinced that it was genuine, but it was more that it's the spiritual boost it gave me, not so much about the facts, but more in my own life, which so impressed me. I just felt like I was just walking on air when I was there, even though it'd been very tough to get there. The weeks walking and just camping and eating, just buying stuff in shops and eating. So it was a really penitential experience.
Sounds like you really had the penance part of the message of prayer and penance.
Very much so. Which unfortunately that's missing now, because you can go there and it's sort of luxury type. I think we need to rediscover that aspect.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So that was in the 80s. And then you said you discovered, you kind of learned about Medjugorje in 1988 and looked into it. Now, can you just give us, I think most of our watchers and listeners know the basics, but why don't you just in case some don't, why don't you give us the basics of what is claimed to be happening and has happened at Medjugorje, over the past 40 years? Yeah.
Well, it started in 1981, so that's, this is now the 40th anniversary, as it were. It sort of revolved around a group of 6 children who, it started off with 2 of them who initially, on the 24th of June, this was 1981, they saw what they call the Gospa, which is, Our Lady in Croatian. And from there, Vitska and these various other visionaries joined in. And in the end, it was a sort of group of 6, ranging in ages from about 10, Yakov, up to about 16. So, I mean, that's a sort of at first point is if you look at the recognized Marian apparitions, generally they're younger than that. The Fatima children, St. Bernadette. So they were slightly older, and obviously as time has gone on, they're much older than the normal age of the recognized apparitions. So what happened was, over the first week, 10 days or so, they claimed, they were seeing something, they claimed, and the crowds of people started to follow them, and they were up on the hill, the sort of Podbro, and it got to the point where the authorities, because obviously communism was still in place then in Yugoslavia, became very worried, and they were being obstructive, to these crowds, and because there was always this worry in Yugoslavia about sort of nationalism reasserting itself and the country basically falling apart, which is what eventually did happen. So that was the first week. Now the thing is, if you actually go into what happened during the first week and what's claimed, then if you compare it, say, with Fatima, there's a totally different story. What happened was the parish priest, Father Zovko, was away at the time, and he only came back after about 3 or 4 days. And before that, his curate, Father Kuvalo, started taping the visionaries. So we've got a series of tapes covering that sort of first week, 10 days, which are really the primary evidence for Medjugorje. And that's very important, because that's a counter to things that are said later on, which have turned out not to be true. Some of the things, the visionaries have said. So that was the first week or so. And another crucial point about the initial stage is that after about a week, there's a definite, Father Zovko, who was the parish priest, was getting very worried because of the authorities, starting to put pressure on them. And they wanted to get the people and the visionaries into the church and not have them out in the open, because it was just too much of a problem.
At this point, they were seeing the apparitions on a mountain, right? On a hill or something, correct?
On the hill, yes. They were going up. And but then after about a week, Father Zovko was saying, when is this going to end? This is on the tapes. And the message that came back from the visionaries, talking about 3 more days. So the visions were actually supposed to end, and it's quite definitely on the tapes, on the 3rd of July, 1981. But as we all know, they went on, and they've carried on now, for some of them for 40 years.
So, okay, so we have about a week's worth, a little bit over maybe 10 days worth of apparitions that are occurring. But then they continue, even though the visionaries say at one point, they say it's going to end on the 3rd of July, but then it continues on. So then I correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe so. Some of did you say there was, I'm confused. I said there were 7, there were 6 visionaries.
6. Well, I mean, actually there was another person who was actually who was a part of it, but he dropped out very quickly.
Okay, that must have been where I had 7 in my head. So 6 young people who are saying they're seeing the Blessed Virgin, and they do it for about 10 days or so, but then it continues on. And then now 40 years later, some of them, how many of them still claim to be, do any of them still claim to be receiving daily visions?
Well, 3 of them, and of the others, there were 3 who were having periodic ones.
Okay.
But I think I need to check again, but I think one of them has dropped out now.
Okay.
So
this is the early 80s. And so then it becomes pretty quickly a big deal, right? I mean, you already said that the priest is getting nervous.
Yeah.
But I mean, what was it like in the first few years there, as far as, so it moved into the parish church and it was a daily occurrence, but what was the relationship early on then with the communist government? Because I can't imagine, like you said, they would be, they're probably trying to tap down any type of movement that might cause nationalism. So what was that relationship like early on then with the communist authorities?
They were hostile to the visionaries, undoubtedly. This obstructive, and they having them examined by psychiatrists and this sort of thing. So they certainly, initially they were not supportive, but gradually over time, as the pilgrims came, it was gradually they realised that this was a possibility for revenue. Obviously, a communist country they wanted pilgrim dollars, or so. So it changed over time, and then they gradually became more, and eventually there was something even on the sort of communist television about quite a supportive program about it. So that was gradual change, and of course then once Tito died, things started to sort of unravel a bit with in the 90s, and obviously you had the Civil War. So during that period there was this gradual growth in sort of nationalism, which the Franciscans in particular, who were there, as part of the, they were the main priests, as it were, looking after the pastoral role. They focused on this the nationalist idea, and that was a big driver. And of course, the background to it all is that going back 500 years, that area had been controlled by the Ottoman Empire, and the Franciscans were the only priests that were allowed to remain. So they were under this sort of domination of the Ottoman Empire. And that only changed in the 19th century when the Habsburg Empire sort of pushed the Ottomans back. But then by that time, the Franciscans were sort of so embedded that they didn't really want to give up the parishes. So there was this dispute then between them and the local bishops, and even with Rome, and they were ordered to toe the line, and they didn't. It's only, there was quite a lot of resistance. So that's an important background thing, which most people don't know about Medjugorje supporters, or not aware of the implications of it.
So there's already a history there of the Franciscans, let's just say, having some obedience issues with, we'll just say. So what was obviously if this happened, any Catholic church this happens in, this would be a big deal for the diocese, for the diocesan bishop. So what was the initial reaction then of the diocesan bishop at the time? I'm forgetting his name, of course, is in the book, but what was his initial reaction to what was going on in the early 80s?
Yeah, the Bishop Zanic, he was quite, initially he was open to the idea. Over time, he just, certain things came up. You had, the problems with some of the things that the visionaries said, and basically their disobedience. And then he took the position then that it possibly was an hallucination. That was it became his sort of viewpoint. But then later on, it was said then that, there was a sort of like a smear campaign, if you like, to say that he'd been intimidated by the communists, and he'd just been scared to to back things. So, but then that was the initial thing with, and he was a very Marian bishop. He'd been to Lourdes. And the other thing to remember, an important point people are not aware of, is that the bishop previous, Bishop Cule, C-U-L-E, I'm not the pronunciation, but anyway, he'd set up a shrine at a place called Hrasno, which was about 20 or 30 miles away from Medjugorje, of Our Lady as sort of Queen of Peace. So that was there as a background. So then you've got to ask yourself, well, would Our Lady then appear, just up the road, as it were,
right?
As a sort of rival to the shrine that had been set up. So yeah, so that was the initial thing anyway, and then that was carried on by Bishop Perich, who was the successor of Bishop Zanich.
Okay. And now you mentioned how Fatima, the message is very much prayer and penance. What was the message of the divisionaries were saying that the apparition of Our Lady was giving to them, at least early on? What was was there a specific message that she was giving them to build a shrine, to penance, there's something's going to happen, some type of anything like that? What was she saying early on, according to the visionary?
Well, the thing is, if you look at the transcripts of the tapes, which are, Father Zovko was recording what they were saying after when he got back. At the end of the week, he said quite openly, he said, well, there is no message here. There's nothing. And when you look at the transcripts, there's no message. It's just a sort of disjointed series of remarks. My angels do this. Be at peace with one another. It's a sort of vague, generalized thing, which, if you compare it to Fatima, which again, there were six main apparitions. There you had a message which was really coherent right from the word go. Are you prepared to offer yourselves? Prepared to offer sacrifices and prayers, and so if you compare the two in that respect, then the Medjugorje, there is no message really. It's just a vague. And in fact, that Father Zovko was saying to the visionaries on the tapes, doesn't she say anything to you? What is the message? And they were sort of admitting, say, well, unless we ask a question, she doesn't say anything. Okay. So it's like as if they've been drawn in. Right. That's the sort of.
Okay. So we've kind of danced around the issue here because I wanted to make sure people had a good background on it. So I want to get to the bottom line first, and we can talk about it in more detail. So what do you believe what do you think happened at Medjugorje? What's been happening since? Like, is it a valid Marian apparition? If it's not, then what is it?
Personally, I don't think it's valid. I mean, looking at the tapes and comparing what happened there and the general demeanor, if you like, of the gospel, it points to a diabolical involvement of some sort. And I'm not saying that lightly. But that's, if you compare how the gospel appeared, literally materialized, as it were, with some apparitions which are certainly not genuine, then it's got more in common with them than with the genuine apparitions. And in a concrete sense, what I mean by that is, say for instance at Lourdes or Fatima, when Our Lady appears, she appears sort of instantaneously, it's like a light going on. There isn't this sort of, whereas at Medjugorje, you've got this sort of gradual sort of mistiness clearing type of phenomena, which then resolves itself and becomes the thing. And I compare it in the book with what the traditional thing of a fortune teller with a crystal ball. They see a cloud in the crystal ball, and it gradually resolves into something they can think. So there's that type of appearance, which now if you take that and then in line with the some of the things for instance, the gospel was in one of the early visions was holding what they thought was a baby, and then she was hiding it, and when they were able to touch the gospel, and their fingers bounced off as if she was made of steel, and she was laughing with them. It's totally unlike the normal apparitions of what the recognized ones of Our Lady. Right. So there are just so many problems and then the fact that before the 3 days business, they asked her how long she was going to appear to them, and she said, as long as you want. So it's just sort of open ended. I'll appear as long as you want, but then 3 more days. Right. So it's just the devil is that to me anyway. It seems there's a diabolical.
So you would argue then that at least at the beginning, the apparitions they likely. You would argue then that the visionaries likely did see something.
Yeah,
like it just wasn't made up as a fraud from the beginning of like, okay, let's just make something up. But they actually did see something, but it was diabolical in nature. Correct?
Yes, I think because once you look at the tapes, the transcripts, you can see that and their reactions, from other people, other evidence, and the fact that other people who went up to the hill, they saw things as well. They saw sort of lights and things, so something was happening, that quite definitely. But then it becomes a question of what was it, and then. Obviously, after about the first 10 days, I think then you're into the realm of sort of fabrication.
Okay.
But probably under pressure from the Franciscans.
Because that's an important. I just want to make sure we're clear on that, and so people understand that's an important point. So what you're basically claiming is that you think it's most likely that in those first 10 days or so, before she said she was going to stop appearing, it's diabolical in nature. But after that, it's more deceptive in the sense that they're not really seeing anything. They're just saying they are, but nothing's actually appearing to them after that point. Okay. Yeah,
I think that seems to me that this is the most logical explanation for what for how things have turned out.
Okay.
I think that's the.
And what are now? Okay, you have a book that is. Let me see here real quick. Almost 500 pages in length. Mm-hmm. And so you detail this obviously in this book, and I've read this. It's a very good book. But why don't you give us here maybe 2 or 3 of the most concrete reasons or examples why you would say this is not the Blessed Virgin? Like, what are 2 or 3 things that she's either said or done, or the visionaries have said or done, that you would say, okay, that basically rules it out, that this could be an authentic Marian apparition?
Well, it does. It comes down to this sort of the general things. The 3 more days, is a classic example that you've got something that hasn't turned out to be true, yet it's there on the tapes. And just the general demeanor. It's a real. You've got all sorts of other aspects to it as well. The fact, that even within the Rini report, which perhaps we can talk about a bit later on. There's a commission, under Pope Benedict, and even there they acknowledge that Ivan, one of the seers, had lied. So you've got the lying, that aspect of it as well. But it's really you've got it's within the first week, and the things. Well, another thing about the vision talking about unbelieving Judases, these sort of things. There's just so many anomalies that it's a cumulative thing, really.
Right.
And the other thing would be that you've got the element of with the fabrication thing, of the one of the priests, the Franciscans. This was a witness, one of the early times, saying, there were too many people in the apparition room. He's saying, unless you all get out, or most of you get out, there's not going to be an apparition tonight. So, as if like he could control whether Our Lady appeared or not.
Right.
That's another thing, that this idea that, they can shift the place where the vision, the gospel was appearing into the church. You don't get that with any of the Marian apparitions. Our Lady decides where she's going to appear. So that would be there are lots of other aspects as well.
I could be confusing apparitions, but I feel like Our Lady of Guadalupe, like, didn't Juan Diego say, I can't make it here or something like that? And she was like, you're going to, or something. I can't remember the details, but somehow like basically he was like, this is like, and so he did. I mean, like she told him where she was going to be. She didn't, he didn't tell her where to be.
No. I think it was with Guadalupe. I think he tried to avoid Our Lady because he was worried.
Yeah, right. That's what it was. Yeah, right.
Yeah. So he went another way, but she sort of intercepted him.
Yeah, right. That's what it was. Okay, I knew it was something like that. Like, nice try, but I'm gonna control this apparition here. Okay, so I think the number one argument I have heard for the authenticity of the what's happening in Medjugorje is the good fruits that come of it. And I want to tell a little story here, a personal story. for the audience is, and I shared this with you already, but so when in the early 90s, I was Protestant and I was hanging out with Catholics, a number were charismatic Catholics. And one of them, I think at least one of them, had been to Medjugorje and had come back and talked about it. And so I got interested in it. As a Protestant, I got interested in it. And I came to believe as a Protestant, okay, really the Blessed Mother is appearing there. This is like 1992. 1992, I guess it was. And then I remember because then I was in Cincinnati area, and Wayne Weibel, who is, for those who don't know, he was an early major proponent of Medjugorje, and he was Protestant though. And so my Catholic friends thought this would be perfect for me to go to because he was a Protestant at the time and he was going to talk about it. And I was a Protestant who accepted it. And we went to the talk, and it was funny because in his talk, he announced that he raised up his rosary and announced he was becoming Catholic. And I didn't know that time. And it was very embarrassing for me, awkward, I should say, because I was like, oh no, my Catholic friends are like looking at me, and I'm just like, oh no, I'm like, now this looks bad. But I will say 2 days after that, I decided to pray the rosary because of listening to Wayne Weibel. And a couple days into, I said, I'm going to pray the rosary for 7 days consecutive, 7 consecutive days. And I'll decide at the end whether or not to become Catholic. And I only made it 2 days in, I decided to become Catholic. And so my conversion story is very linked, even though I've never been there, linked to it. Now, over time, that's been, almost 30 years ago that this happened. I have grown in my skepticism of Medjugorje. Now I basically hold the same view you do. But ultimately, the question has to be answered. That's obviously a good fruit that is at least linked to what's happening there. And of course, there's tons of stories of people going there, converting, coming back to the sacraments, people who live faithful lives now who are associated with it. What's your response to the fact that, this is obviously a reality, and how could that be something diabolical if so many good fruits are coming from it?
Yeah, it's a good question, Eric. I think the way I would look at it is to say, obviously, we're going through a crisis in the church, and have been for a long time.
This crisis, magazine.
Yeah. So, obviously, after Vatican II, a lot of the devotions were stopped in churches, and the statues of Our Lady got thrown out, and so on. So there was a sort of vacuum, really. And when the Medjugorje, when the thing started, the fact that Our Lady was apparently appearing every day, that was a great boost for it. And that was one of the main factors. Plus, as you mentioned about the charismatics, there was a charismatic network around the world that was able to promote it. So you've got the situation then where, if you like, assuming it's not genuine, then you can say, well, what is God going to do about it? Normally, he doesn't intervene in sort of dramatic and huge ways. So, but he can turn things so that something which is not genuine or good in itself can be used as a vehicle to help people. So the fact that people were going there and there was this vacuum, then if the person is genuine, such as you were genuine, you said, well, I'm going to pray the rosary, then you will get the grace to convert. But that could have come from any other, and it would happen in any other format. Then you would have had the grace as well. So I think it's just this vacuum, and God always bringing good out of evil, as it were. I think that's the main explanation. Right. And obviously, as you say, a lot of people have been converted and so on. Again, if their connection with Medjugorje was the only opportunity for them to be converted, then God is not going to sort of say, well, I'm not, just because it's Medjugorje, I'm not going to give the grace. So I think that's a sort of, in a nutshell, would be my explanation for that.
Okay. And then in the book, you also mention, of course, the good fruits argument comes from our Lord's words that by their fruits you shall know them. And a good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and bad tree can't bear good fruit. And so, but you make an argument about that passage in application to these apparitions. Could you explain that? Because I thought that was very interesting when I read that. I had not really heard that argument myself. And so I want you to share that one with us.
Well, it's just this idea. If you actually look at what Christ said, he's saying you will know them by their fruits. So it's not talking about the actual fruits, because in the sense of people being converted, etc., they can very well be genuine, but it's more the focus is on the actual people claiming to be receiving the supernatural communications. And if you look at the way the things are worked out with the visionaries, particularly someone like Ivan, and the sort of involvement in money things and hotels and stuff. It's murky, shall we say, in comparison with what say for instance Saint Bernadette, who they lived in a little cell, like a old prison type thing, damp insanitary place, and she wouldn't accept any money. And the Fatima seers, they wouldn't accept money, and Sister Lucia became, Carmelite eventually. So you've got this contrast really between the two, which is quite marked. So, but that's the whole thing of, you will know them by their fruits. That's the key phrase, I think.
That was one of the things that I admit was one of the first things. This was probably 5 or 10 years after this. I can't remember now exactly when it was, but I remember reading about how at least some of the seers were living, very expensive house and, traveling, things like that. And I admit that was probably the first time I was like, I'm not like a anti-money person that think that people can't be rich. I think it makes it more difficult to get to heaven if you're rich, but like our Lord says, but at the same time, it seems to me that at least what I knew about Bernadette, Sister Lucia, people like that, it was like, they did not live like that. They did not seem to have any material benefits from their visions. In fact, quite the opposite. They ended up choosing a life of great penance and hardship.
Oh yeah, very much so. Yeah, that's a very important point. I think the good fruits. I mean, for instance, you take something like confession. The confession there at Medjugorje was part of the culture. There was a very strong emphasis on confession. So then, if people from the West, where confession is virtually died out in many respects, they go there, and then the priests are hearing the confessions. It can be a powerful emotional thing, and then they go to confession, and of course they get all the grace. So this is the problem really of careful sort of discernment, of what is actually God acting and what is just natural things. I think that's the important thing, or even diabolical.
Yeah, in a sense, it's like the crucifixion itself, that we see the centurion who has this conversion moment, and of course the crucifixion is good. We call it Good Friday, but yet it also is the most ultimate act of evil ever committed.
Yeah, and
so the people who did it, they did an evil thing. It doesn't all of a sudden mean that they did a good thing. They did an evil thing by killing our Lord, but God used it for good, and he, including the conversion of the centurion right there, but just obviously for all our salvation. So that's an important point, that when we talk about good fruits, it's not like our Lord wouldn't would make the confessions that happen there invalid just because they're there. They're still going to give you the sacramental graces needed. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Now, I remember back when I was more into this, in like I said, in the 90s and supportive of it, it seemed like every week there was a new thing. But, the church is approving it next week, or the church says this. Oh, actually, I know that everybody knew the local bishop was against it. You couldn't try to twist and spin that one. But they'd always say that Pope John Paul II said this positive thing about it, or they're about, they said it was okay to go pilgrimage there, or whatever. And as a support of kind of suggesting or implying that official support has been given by the church to these apparitions. Now, we know that the local bishop from the beginning really almost from the beginning, he was trying to at first to see if it was okay, but basically has condemned it, or at least has said it's not a supernatural event from the beginning. What has the church said as far as the Vatican, popes, or what have you, over time, and what's the official status of Medjugorje in the eyes of the church?
Well, up to this point, it's still not approved in any sort of concrete way. You had various commissions, and then you had about 10 years after, in 1991, had what's called the Zadar Declaration, and that was a commission basically of the bishops, and they came to the conclusion, nothing supernatural could be demonstrated to have happened at Medjugorje, which actually, after 10 years, is essentially a negative decision. So that's worth pointing out. That
why do you think they didn't just say it's not it's not a legitimate apparition at all, and people, Catholics shouldn't go to it, and it's actually probably demonic or deceptive. Why do you think they weren't? I mean, because it sounds like they're saying it's not supernatural, which I know a lot of people interpret as, well, they're not saying it's not supernatural. It's kind of like, it seems a little bit ambiguous. And so at least to a lot of the adherents of Medjugorje, it seems a little ambiguous. So why do you think it wasn't stated more clearly that this is clearly not the Blessed Virgin?
Yeah, I think that's possibly, it's difficult to say, but it's possibly due to sort of internal church dynamics, quite possibly. I mean, John Paul II, possibly at that point, and the fact that it was in Eastern Europe, and the Poland had sort of opened up and everything, probably didn't want to stop the movement, whether or not he thought the thing was actually genuine. But the fact that you had this sort of anti-communist movement, growing, which was helping to, hopefully free Eastern Europe, that was probably part of it. But then over time, the sort of the more or less consistent thing has been there's an allowance to some extent of pilgrimages, but without that making any impact on whether or not the thing was actually proven. So then obviously you had then the Rini Commission that was reported in 2014, and Pope Benedict was from what he said, was quite skeptical about the truth. He was not about the truth of Medjugorje. But with Pope Francis, and when Pope Francis sort of came in, he was initially saying, he didn't believe in Our Lady as a postmistress who's delivering a message every day. So that was the thing. But apparently, more recently, he is moved more to towards acceptance. But we then obviously you've got this business which the Archbishop Jose was sent there, and he's the sort of delegate. So I think what they're trying to do is sort of sit on the fence a bit and say, we're not going to say it's not true, but we can look after the pastoral needs of the pilgrims, which to a certain extent is true. People are going there, and they need to be looked after, otherwise they can be exploited. So
it wasn't just a couple of weeks ago. Not that recently, there was a big conference there, a big rally or something there, and the Pope, I believe, Pope Francis did send a message to it. And so to me, I can understand how a typical just average Catholic who's not really trying to pay attention to all the details and not reading these commission reports and like that would be like, well, the Pope endorses it. He's given a message to the pilgrims there, so that must mean it's a legitimate apparition. How would you answer something like that? Because I think that's a legitimate. I can see why a regular Catholic would think that. How would you respond to somebody like that?
Well, I would say unless some sort of authoritative decision is come to, then interventions like that are really just a sign of the Pope's personal opinion. It's not binding on anybody. Of course, no one is obliged to believe in any private revelation anyway. It's not like public revelation where you have to believe it. It's a non-binding thing. So I think we have to look at, as I was saying, in the sort of the overall situation of, the facts on the ground. I mean, it's the facts are the important thing. What actually happened right at the beginning. Right. And if you compare it, say, with some of the approved apparitions, like at La Salette, that the children saw Our Lady, and it only lasted a couple of hours. And when they got back down from the mountain, immediately one of the neighbors sort of took a written account of what they'd said. And this has happened to the other thing. So you've got to base the judgment on what actually happened, and also to some extent the fruits, but that includes the fruits of conversion and healings. And whereas you'd say, Lord, you've got genuine healings, Medjugorje, they sent some of the purported healing, things, dossiers there, but they said we can't accept any of these because they're not in the proper format. There's no real hard evidence to back up any of these claims. So, and of course, then you've got the whole thing about the scientific medical tests on the visionaries, which I did a chapter in the book about that. And really, they're just not. They weren't rigorous enough. They weren't scientific. That's the problem.
Right. Yeah, and obviously we're just kind of skimming over the surface of all this
Yeah.
for the podcast, but I do encourage people. Here's the, put the book up, Medjugorje and Complete, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes where you can purchase it from Angelico Press. Because if you really want to hear the full arguments, obviously read the book.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're not going to get that all here, but I think you did a good job of covering the overall. And so what I would just say then, like kind of to wrap things up, I would imagine there are some listeners to this podcast who faithful Catholics, good Catholics, who are devoted to Medjugorje. And what would you say to them? Like, what would you, obviously they might be upset and they might disagree with you. And, we understand that. But what would you say to them as far as how their faith life is integrated with Medjugorje and, potential dangers of that, or just in general, what's your message to them?
Well, I think, if somebody's come to the faith or, come back to the church or come into the church in Medjugorje, that's good. And I've got no criticism of that. I think the problem is, though, it's taking people away from Fatima, which is the preeminent apparition of our time, the whole thing of the conversion of Russia and then Our Lady promising a period of peace for the world. So if you've got something which is basically a distraction from that, which what I argue in Medjugorje is, then people really need to sort of move on from Medjugorje and say, okay, well, it's helped me, it's been a support, but to get to my destination, I really need to sort of get on a different bus, as it were. I need to just sort of change. You're still going towards Our Lady and towards God, but you're on a more certain path. I mean, there's been so much contention with Medjugorje. I mean, this is what I compare it in the book with. Supposing you've got to get from A to B, and one route is across a sort of an unlit bit of waste ground, and the other bit is going around a bit longer, and you've got the street lights and everything, and this is you're in a dangerous place, right. And obviously we are in a dangerous place in the state of the world. Then you're not going to, you'd be foolish to go across the waste ground rather than take the longer trip around, the thing. So as I say to people, with things like Fatima and Lourdes, you're morally certain that it's genuine. Whereas in Medjugorje, you're just in a sort of total state of uncertainty. Yeah. And the fact that people are not doing the 5 First Saturdays and they're not saying the Rosary in the sort of way that Our Lady wants, with the devotion, but she's saying God wants to establish devotion of my Immaculate Heart throughout the world. Well, on a scale of sort of 1 to 100, where are we on that as a church? 2 or 3%, if that.
Right.
You get away from places like the Philippines and Poland. I mean, the situation in America is much better than in Britain, but it's a very, in terms of the message of Fatima being implemented, we've got a massive hill to climb, a mountain to climb, really. So that's what I would say to people, please, look critically at Medjugorje and go for something which is genuine and which is approved by the church and which you can have 100% confidence about. Right.
That's a great point. I mean, we have, it's not like we're saying we're rejecting all apparitions or anything like that. And like you said, a Catholic does not have to believe in any of the private revelations, of course. But I like the phrase you said, moral certainty, with Fatima and Lourdes. I mean, these are two that have stood the test of time. I mean, we have feast days for them where, the church has clearly said these are messages we should listen to. And Fatima, of course, being the preeminent one of the 20th and going into 20th. It's not like, it stopped when we got to the 21st century either, the need for it. So that's a great point. Okay, well, I really appreciate you being on. Where can people find out more information about your book and about you and what you're doing?
Well, you've got the book on the Angelico Press site, and my own website is Theotokos, which is, the Greek word for Our Lady is God-bearer. So that's theotokos.org.uk, and that's where the website is. And I've just got general information about apparitions and previous versions of the book. But obviously now this book is a big update. So buy the new book is what I would say. You might see it on Amazon still, but buy the new one, particularly because I do a sort of analysis of the Rini report, which I think demonstrates that in the long run, there's going to need to be a much bigger, enlarged, more international commission I don't think we're going to get a resolution of this. I mean, I could be wrong. Pope Francis could turn around tomorrow and say do something, but I think it's taken quite a long time to get where we are, and I think it's going to take quite a long time to get out at the other end as well. But it needs something really authoritative, which looks at the transcripts of the tapes and really analyzes them.
Right.
So that'd be
great. I will definitely link to that in the show notes. So I encourage people to go to that site. Again, I really appreciate your time. Thanks so much for being on the program.
Great. Thank you, Eric. Yeah, my pleasure. It's lovely.
Okay, great. Okay, everybody, until next